Move faster! Right here, in that direction.
The hottest spot is the Pokrovsk direction. Special Operations Forces soldiers are clearing out a mine that Russian infantry managed to infiltrate. Ukrainian soldiers shared footage and details of the successful operation on social media. Enemy forces on the industrial site were spotted by aerial reconnaissance pilots, and the Special Operations Forces soldiers, waiting for favorable weather conditions and with drone support, set out on the mission and eliminated the enemy without any losses. The Russians often, when they make contact, don't shoot, but instead call in their pilots with FPV drones, and those drones immediately come after us. That's why we stayed there for about 5 or 10 minutes and then pulled back. After that, our guys took care of their FPV operators. In addition, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces successfully struck Russian targets in 2 regions, destroying with drones the locations where Russian troops were concentrated in Pokrovsk and an ammunition depot in Beloyarovka, Donetsk region. And in Luhansk, they burned down a fuel and lubricants depot. Meanwhile, in Moscow, they once again claimed to have allegedly captured 3 Ukrainian cities at once: Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, and Vovchansk. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine refuted this information and assured that the Ukrainian army continues to hold key positions. And the Russian statements are nothing more than another round of propaganda and an attempt by the Kremlin to influence participants in international negotiations. Analysts add that Russian generals are deliberately immersing Putin in a parallel world of imaginary victories.
Yet another territory taken on credit, and yet another statement claiming that Pokrovsk has been captured. Of course, you could laugh at this, but I'm afraid all of this will be fed to Mitro, and once again there will be pressure, claiming that the situation on the battlefield is developing against the Ukrainian army.
For more than a month, Putin has been convincing Russians that the Russian army has captured Kupiansk and that supposedly 15 battalions of the Ukrainian army are surrounded there. But the Joint Forces Group of the Ukrainian Armed Forces stated that most of the city is under the control of Ukrainian troops, and only isolated groups of Russian invaders are holding positions in the northern districts.
If everything were going well, or at least unfolding according to the Russian deadlines and the implementation of their plans, then probably today they wouldn't have had to use at least one of the Putins in military uniform to carry out an information psychological special operation.
The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has counted 131 battles along the entire front line since the beginning of the day. 29 times the Russians tried to break through Ukrainian defenses in the Liman direction. Another 21 enemy assaults were repelled by the defense forces in the Kostiantynivka sector of the front. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine noted that the Russian army has intensified its airstrikes on Ukraine. In the 11 months of this year, the Russians have already dropped nearly 44,000 guided aerial bombs. The hottest month in terms of the number of guided aerial bombs, KABs, used by the Russian army to attack our units was October 2025. A total of 5,328 guided aerial bombs were recorded. This year, the Russian army has intensified its aerial terror. For comparison, during 2024, enemy aircraft dropped nearly 40,000 guided aerial bombs, averaging 109 KABs per day. In the 11 months of 2025, almost 44,000 guided aerial bombs. That's an average of 130 CABs per day. And now, a statement from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Under the cover of thick fog, the Russians tried to slip through Ukrainian positions unnoticed at one section of the front. However, the assault troops on motorcycles were spotted and eliminated by Ukrainian tank crews. In total, over the past day, the defense forces have eliminated 1,110 Russian occupiers. And the total losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine have already exceeded 1,175,000 soldiers. These figures were announced by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Additionally, the defense forces destroyed 1 armored combat vehicle, 14 artillery systems, and 49 units of Russian automotive and special equipment.
Well, honestly, if everything were going well, or at least if things were going according to the Russian deadlines and the implementation of their plans, then probably they wouldn't have had to use at least one of the Putins in military uniform today to carry out an information psychological special operation. We all understand perfectly well that if Citizen Putin, who calls himself the President of the Russian Federation, He comes out of his bunker today and starts shouting to the whole world, look, I've captured Pokrovsk, a city that up until today, if you gave him a map of Ukraine, he probably wouldn't even be able to point out. Accordingly, this shows that, to be honest, things haven't turned out at all the way they were supposed to. For more than a year and 3 months, Russian troops have been trying to occupy Pokrovsk. Well, in fact, we can see what's happening today. Yes, the Russians are in control today. Most of Pokrovsk. Today, most of the city is what's called a gray zone. Today, the Russians are trying as much as possible to completely disrupt our logistics, including those of the Mirnograd garrison, since this is all one Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration. However, in any case, even today, despite all the Russians' efforts, the defensive operation in Pokrovsk continues. Moreover, the events at the Dobropolye salient, the Russian publisher who not only had his ears cut off, as they say, but everything was cut off at once. This is part of the Pokrovsk operation, the Ukrainian Pokrovsk operation of a defensive nature. However, the Dobropolye direction has actually become a model of maneuverable defense. This is, first of all, counterattacking defense. And today we see the depth of penetration of Russian forces, the depth of our defense, up to 17 kilometers. Thanks to the efforts of various structural units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, it was reduced to 4 kilometers. That is, most of this area, this patch of our territory, has been cleared and is now free of the enemy. Today, many people in the media space are saying that over the past month, Russia has occupied 505 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. Yes, we can see that today. But why does no one talk about how much has been liberated, for example, in the Dobropolye direction, or how much has been freed today, for instance, in the city of Kupiansk? That's why we fully understand that the scenarios for how things might develop at the front, particularly around Pokrovsk, could be different. Probably even with certain, to put it mildly, disadvantages for us. I'm not naming these scenarios right now. Everyone can, as they say, think them up or imagine them, but without any conspiracy theories. The defense forces have a response for any of these scenarios. Certain actions will be taken, one way or another. The main thing is to preserve the lives of our soldiers, and accordingly to inflict maximum damage on Russian logistics, to wear down Russian forces as much as possible, forces that are already struggling today in the Pokrovsk direction and are being forced to use operational resources and reserves. It's obvious that today the Russians would probably like to transfer some of their troops from Pokrovsk to the Huliopol direction. Unfortunately, that's just how things are for them today. Those are the realities. There is some advance toward Huliopol, and attempts even today to infiltrate directly into the settlement itself. However, we see that Pokrovsk is fulfilling this role. Today, it is holding back, among other things, the development of events on other fronts.
Serhiy, I actually want to, in this context, because we very often talk with you about the different directions, our next topic will be about Putin's fantasies. Yes, she was fantasizing about new conquests, but that's not even the point. But about this, somehow Putin doesn't fantasize about it. I'm sorry to put it that way. He doesn't fantasize, he doesn't talk about it. Now it's about the losses. I'm talking now specifically about the losses of the Russian army, military losses. By the end of the year, the Russian army once again reached record, by the way, raids. Losses of personnel over all 4 years of the full-scale war. More than 25,000 killed per month. This was stated by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, during his visit to Paris for talks with French President Emmanuel Macron. At that time, Zelensky once again refuted Putin's lies about the capture of yet another Ukrainian settlement. This time it was about Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. We're about to hear from the president of Ukraine, Sergei, and then we'll continue our discussion about the losses of the Russian army.
Undoubtedly, Russia has made some advances, and undoubtedly, Russia has carried out several offensive actions, several operations. But none of these operations have been successful. Of course, there are fierce battles going on in Pokrovsk itself and in other directions. For example, our guys have had more success in the Kupiansk direction, even though Russia claims it has captured Kupiansk, but to be honest, we've almost cleared everyone out of that city.
Sergei, do you remember a few years ago when the number was 300,000? We said, well, that's already a figure that, if not stopping them, at least makes the Russian general staff and the Kremlin think. Then it was 500, then 600, 700, and now it's long since past 1 million, right? And on top of that, there's another 175,000. So it turns out, after all, that it's clear they don't spare Russians. But for the country, in terms of territory, a huge country, is it really possible for a country to just calmly end up without an army?
Moreover, Russia could end up without a working-age male population. After all, today, for example, the gaps in the labor market have long been measured in millions. These gaps, they're different numbers. For example, from 4 to 5 million. That's what Russia has already lost in the labor market today. As of today, I fully understand that the Russian tradition, the horde tradition, it can and is already using this approach today, driving citizens of other countries into the Russian hinterland accordingly. And we can see how deeply migrants are penetrating Russian life, everyday life. Today, the borders in the Far East are basically open, and Siberia is open to the Chinese. Well, obviously, the Chinese are taking advantage of this opportunity and using it to their benefit too. And that's how things will keep going. And these are just, the rough numbers. This is just the tip of the iceberg of problems that the Russian Federation will face. Today, yes, we also have losses. This war, unfortunately, yes, has brought a lot of hardship. The Russian Federation has brought this upon us, and we will have to work very hard. And not just work hard to rebuild the country, but also so that our people can return home, among other things. But for Russia, it seems to me these losses will be even more devastating. In fact, I think that citizen Putin today, calling himself the president of the Russian Empire, has actually already set in motion the final stage of the collapse of this pseudo-empire. And whether he understands this or not, to be honest, as a citizen of Ukraine, I couldn't care less. However, I want to believe that, indeed, this process, these two main old men, as they're called in the Russian army, the two main old men, whom, by the way, they already want to get rid of, that's what the soldiers of the so-called airborne forces of the Russian Federation are saying, for example. There they go, limping along. But it's not them who are limping, it's the Russian Federation that's limping. And someday, they're going to fall flat on both feet. We understand all of this perfectly well. That's why these problems for Russians will only grow. After all, when we talk, for example, including myself, about the economy, just a little bit, I'm not an expert in economics, but still, it's obvious that today, that huge budget, for next year, the Russian Federation, a huge military budget, a record one, Russians are shouting, now we're really going to show those Ukrainians, just you wait. But no, that's not what this is about at all. You're definitely not going to give us anything, well, except maybe your fallen soldiers. This is about the Russian Federation today, having pulled out everything from all its hideouts and from all its chests, all those remaining funds, including the sale of gold reserves, in order to continue this murderous, terrorist, aggressive war against Ukraine. However, without having the strategic successes, which, by the way, the Ukrainian president spoke about. There is tactical advancement. Well, look, I'll remember again. Pokrovsk, years have been beaten for 3 months. They created the cult of Pokrovsk. Well, that's the impression you get. No doubt, every one of our towns is dear to us. But when the Russians, busy planting flags, shout about capturing yet another destroyed water tower, we understand perfectly well what's going on with this so-called society, and what Putin has done to this so-called Russia. That's why it's obvious that everything happening today will still lead to the collapse of the Russian Federation. It's hard for us, it's not easy, but I think we'll do everything we can so that, first of all, Ukraine survives. Today, that's clearly our strategic victory. Everything else is just a tool, and that's why I believe that we'll succeed. We'll definitely succeed. And
here's another important point, Sergei. We can see the following situation. The situation at the front is intensifying, with the degree of tension increasing, on the diplomatic stage, so to speak. At this very moment, while we're talking, Putin is also talking with Witkoff, and they're discussing the peace plan that Ukraine, Europe, and the United States have discussed and approved. So in this context, what do you think if Putin refuses this peace plan? We ask the diplomats. What happens next on the diplomatic stage? So if Putin refuses this peace plan, then what? And is there any understanding of what might happen next on the front lines? After all, as practice has shown, Putin has a lot of manpower. In reserve, a lot of cannon fodder that can be sent into battle. But what else can they use to put pressure? And are Ukraine's defense forces ready for this?
You know, even the fullest storehouses eventually run empty. In any case, this is the endgame. And Russia's reserves, it's obvious today that they're not endless either. I mentioned that all social programs in the Russian Federation have now been shut down. That's not happening for no reason. That's what's happening today. And just think how much money Russia, for example, has poured into its propaganda. Today we see that on the surface, there seems to be money, but in reality, it's already gone. We clearly understand today that Russia no longer scares anyone with its nuclear weapons. As for the Russian Federation's nuclear arsenal today, I'm not sure afraid is the right word, although yes, maybe people are afraid, but only if they knew the conditions in which that nuclear weapon is stored accordingly. And as for the military-industrial complex of the Russian Federation, just look at how much of a colossus with feet of clay it is today. And the defense forces are doing everything they can to make sure that these critical enterprises of the Russian military-industrial complex stop functioning. I'm not even talking about the oil refineries. You know, I get the impression that when Ukrainians see reports about yet another strike on another Russian oil refinery, they say, so what's next, right? Like, you know, it's interesting to see where else our guys have done a good job. This isn't easy work. It's tough, hard work for men, and not just men, of course. This is tough combat work carried out by many different units. And we can see how the Russian economy, with these kinds of strikes, is still being gradually undermined. And it's obvious that today, this doesn't allow Russia. Well, you know, it feels like in some ways the Russians are going all in today. Sure, you can fight with just infantry, but for how long? And you know, today I found myself smiling quite a bit, probably in a rather ironic way. Those statements from Putin, for example. Today he presented himself as some kind of surgeon. You know, when he talked about cutting Ukraine off from the sea? They've already tried that, I want to remind them. You are already just a few miles from the coast of Odessa. Ask the crew of the Moskva how that turned out. Today, Putin said that the so-called special military operation is not a war, but rather some kind of surgical intervention, surgical actions, so that Russia can achieve its goals in Ukraine. Well, it really was some kind of surgeon speaking today. There's a very good word in Ukraine. I'll suggest it to Putin. Let someone pass it on to him. All these actions by Russia are summed up very simply, with one word: Rosaris.
By the way, yes, Rosaris is a very popular word in the Ukrainian context, especially if you compare it to drones, which are doing their job very effectively on the front lines. But again, we literally have just a few more minutes left to talk. Sergey, so explain the overall Russian strategy. It has changed once again, hasn't it? It feels like they're in a hurry, especially considering the dictator. Putin is constantly setting deadlines, especially when it comes to capturing Pokrovsk. Just in the last few months, they've announced 10 times that they've taken it. But in reality, no one has taken anything. They're just suffering losses. Unfortunately, we can't show the video on air that Modiar Robert Bravdi published the other day. You know which video I'm talking about, right? Yeah, it's a video in several parts. As a result of unsuccessful attempts to take positions, Russians were left lying on top of other Russians. And does that not bother them at all? This is just the same old Soviet tactic. They just keep pushing forward, knowing this is their last assault.
Well, you know, the emotions of Russians, honestly, at this moment, that's the last thing I care about. That's the truth. I think Putin doesn't care about the emotions of Russians either. God forbid, but that's the only thing that could unite us today. But if we speak without irony and speak very seriously, we understand perfectly well that the argument of manpower on the battlefield, cannon fodder, that too will eventually run out, obviously. These are likely the last arguments of the Russian Tsar. They will try to push further. Yes, and today, look, Putin has come up with it again. This has happened before, as they say in Ukraine. He's invented new sanitary zones, buffer zones, and now he's added the Chernihiv region as well, saying they'll create these kinds of security belts there. I think this isn't really for us Ukrainians, although in part, yes, it's a kind of provocation for us, and about the sea too. We understand. He's talking about Odessa, about Mykolaiv, right? Today, these provocations are also signals for Washington. Look, everything's fine here, we're moving forward, we're about to start expanding our sanitary zones. Let's recall the sums, show them, remind them. And Washington needs to see this too, just without Mr. Vitkov. It would be perfect to do it through Kitkela, for example. So I think this attempt to create some informational trump cards that Putin hopes to use for bargaining, to show off, to argue with during so-called negotiations, or at least during the geopolitical communications that are currently taking place on the battlefield. That's why, obviously, let's put it this way, creating these kinds of informational pretexts is really an attempt to later bargain for some else. In other words, he doesn't control and will not control these territories. But he'll say, well, let's swap Chernihiv for Zaporizhia, for example. Obviously, the strategy, I hope that, since we're discussing this, I think that professional diplomats and our top commanders also understand all of this, and we'll have our own arguments, for example. Yeah, well, arguments from Budanov or from Maluk, yes, those are the most effective on the battlefield. Or from Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, from our defense forces, from our soldiers. That's the most important thing.
Serhiy, to wrap up, once again, here's something very interesting. So the Russian Federation, periodically, besides spreading fakes, steps up attacks on peaceful cities in the rear. Here, Jera. And lately, the city of Dnipro has been suffering a lot. Zaporizhia is suffering too, specifically the city, not the region, but the city itself. But as practice shows, if we're talking about military objectives, these are populated areas with a large number of people. Does the Kremlin understand what they're doing when they drop missiles on residential buildings? Yes.
Yes. And I'll say it a third time, yes. This is terror that can't be explained, and the only argument is to force people to leave these outposts of ours, to abandon these fortresses of ours. Because every settlement in Ukraine is a fortress, especially cities like Odessa, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv. And look, that bunker dweller just can't leave it alone. I mean, I totally get it. If something hit the Kremlin, half of Moscow would definitely scatter. You'd probably see them somewhere around Rublovka, or maybe even farther, flying off toward the Urals. But here, obviously, look, every Ukrainian village is putting up resistance. Just like at the start of the war, some with pitchforks, some with hunting rifles. And today, our arguments are much stronger. We have drones, we have missiles, and most importantly, what we have will not run out, will never run out. That is Ukrainian strength and the Ukrainian spirit. Well, maybe it sounds a bit grandiose, but I say it sincerely, with emotion.
Serhiy, thank you, Sambas. You're always welcome on Freedom's Air. Thank you for finding the time to join us. Serhiy Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, was with us live.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.